Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Access Minnesota brings you the newsmakers and the stories that shape our everyday lives, with analysis from University of Minnesota faculty experts. Now, here's Jim Dubois.
It seemed like an unlikely candidacy, but billionaire Donald Trump is leading the pack of 17 Republican presidential candidates, and he's the only candidate among them with double-digit polling numbers. Hillary Clinton seemed like the presumptive Democratic frontrunner until recently, when Bernie Sanders began attracting large crowds and generating higher polling numbers. The 2016 presidential election is more than a year away, but already much political drama is unfolding. This month on Access Minnesota, we sit down with University of Minnesota political science professor Catherine Pearson to discuss political strategy, the likely front runners, and the issues voters want to hear about in the primaries. We'll learn why more mainstream candidates like Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton are currently overshadowed by fringe politicians like Trump and Sanders, and whether political scientists really believe Trump has a shot at the presidency. Catherine Pearson is an associate professor of political science at the University of Minnesota. Professor Pearson, welcome back to Access Minnesota.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Well, we're a little over a year from the 2016 elections, but things are already heating up. Of course, the biggest activity right now is among the Republican candidates. We'll get to the Democratic race a bit later, but let's talk first of all about perhaps the biggest surprise on the Republican side, the rise of Donald Trump. Did that surprise you that Donald Trump is gaining and maintaining such great traction?
I am a bit surprised that he's maintaining his traction. I think that he has an appeal among voters, particularly Republican voters, for his sort of willingness to defy political convention, willingness to sort of, in his mind, tell it like it is, and willingness to pick a fight with Fox News, who you would think would be an ally of Republican candidates. And so he's sort of willing to pick fights, willing to tell his version of things and not conform to political convention. But at the same time, we've seen sort of summer blips before. I think about Michelle Bachmann around this time 4 years ago winning the Iowa straw poll. I think about the rise and fall of Newt Gingrich as a potential Republican candidate, Herman Cain. So we've seen this dynamic before, the summer over a year out before the general. But Donald Trump is maintaining enthusiasm to a greater extent than I would have predicted. That said, his enthusiasm is among the people, not the people in the electorate, but not necessarily party leaders. In fact, Donald Trump has zero endorsements from party officials, from elected Republicans, and political science research has shown that those party endorsements really pretty decisively predict the next nominee. Now, is it possible that this is an aberration year? Sure, it's certainly possible. But when it comes to party endorsements, Jeb Bush is far away the winner.
What do Trump supporters like about him and his messages?
Well, it's really hard to know. Many of Trump's supporters are Republicans who do vote regularly in elections, but many of his supporters, at least in the electorate, are people who actually don't pay that much attention to politics. And so I think it's fair to say that what people are liking about Trump isn't necessarily a consistent ideological position, because he hasn't been consistent. Now, he's been quite outspoken and taken a conservative position on some issues such as immigration reform. But on the other hand, he's been all over the place on other social issues, and he doesn't have clearly defined positions on a lot of issues that are really important to Republican voters. And so I think people like him because he is brash, he is willing to speak his mind, and again, not defy to political conventions. He hasn't been previously elected, which you would think might be a strike against someone running for president. We would want an experienced president. But I think that success in business really gets him some credibility with potential voters that the other candidates just don't have.
Do voters feel that Trump is less likely to be influenced by corporate money, although he has now backed off on his comment about not accepting third-party contributions to his campaign? Does this set him apart from some of the other candidates, and is this something that resonates with voters, a candidate perhaps who is more incorruptible?
I think think it resonates with voters to some extent. Money in politics is certainly something that voters have very strong opinions about. But by the same token, money in politics allows politicians to get their message out, but Trump doesn't need that money necessarily. On the other hand, during the debate, he clearly admitted that he has given to candidates on both sides of the aisle specifically to curry favor with them. So he has made it very clear that he is willing to play that game, even if not necessarily always as a recipient, although now he is willing to be a recipient. So as more and more money flows into the system with Supreme Court decisions that have made it easier for individuals to spend in unlimited amounts on behalf of candidates or super PACs, even if not directly to candidates, candidates are in tougher positions, sort of saying no to political money.
Why do you think the other Republican candidates are not resonating as well with voters as they may have in the recent past?
I think Americans in general are dissatisfied with government. They're dissatisfied with both parties. And so people with a lot of experience in government, with Republican Party politics, are not necessarily going to be viewed as well as they might have been in an election where government wasn't quite as unpopular. Now, often Americans are dissatisfied with government. This isn't anything new, but I think it's particularly pronounced right now. And Trump is able to capitalize on that a little bit. You know, having the name recognition from his other ventures, but not the connection with politics as usual.
Many of the other Republican candidates were once seen as rising stars in the party. Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, Chris Christie, and Bobby Jindal, to name just a few. Mm-hmm. Is it surprising to you that none of these candidates managed to poll in double digits?
It is surprising to some extent, although of course with a record of public service, that also comes with a record of failures and some policy missteps as well. And so on the one hand, there's more to campaign against when people have a record of public service. And on the other hand, some of these candidates just haven't distinguished themselves in ways that perhaps we might have expected them to, say 5-10 years ago, depending on the candidate. We've seen a lot of polarization, both at the national and state levels, although it depends on the state. And so that's really inhibited a lot of these men, because they're all men in this case, from having the executive branch or legislative accomplishments at their state or in federal office that we might have anticipated many years ago.
Of the 17 Republicans running for president, only 10 were invited to the primetime debate on Fox News. That was purportedly necessary to keep the debate more manageable for television. When you narrow a field like that down, when many of the candidates are within maybe a percentage point of each other, what are the ethical questions involved when you narrow a field that's arguably within a margin of error?
Right. On the one hand, Fox did host a debate that got more attention than any other presidential nominating contest debate at this point. And so that was providing a service to voters and potential voters in introducing the candidates to them. And I think actually Fox did a very good job of researching each candidate that was in that 10-person debate and asking relevant questions about that candidate's record and history. On the other hand, those that were left out, they had that earlier appearance, the children's table, if you will, and really only Carly Fiorina was able to break out of the pack from that. She did well. It was widely reported that she did well. The fact that it was widely reported was, I think, more important than her actual performance. And so that did give her a boost. So they did have some opportunity to distinguish themselves. But it's harder when not very many people are watching and it's an earlier hour and it's sort of known as the lesser candidates debate. So are there, does this make it tough for some candidates? Sure. And if I were one of those candidates who was left out of the main debate, absolutely. I think there's reason to be unhappy about that. But I think overall, in general, Fox provided a real service to people who want to learn about the candidates at this stage in the game.
The Fox News Republican debate drew 24 million viewers. When Access Minnesota returns, Professor Catherine Pearson talks about why the debate drew so many viewers and which candidates fared the best. Though Republican candidate Carly Fiorina was not invited to the primetime Fox News debate, she's perceived by some as the winner of the earlier so-called undercard debate. More on Fiorina's prospects when Access Minnesota returns.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Now back to our conversation with political science professor Catherine Pearson on the 2016 presidential race. The Fox debate attracted an astonishing 24 million viewers. Pretty incredible for a political debate of any sort. Was Donald Trump largely responsible for generating those huge ratings?
Donald Trump can indeed take a lot of credit for those ratings. He had been saying provocative things in the media before leading up to the debate. Certainly that continued throughout the debate and has since. And I think a lot of potential voters and viewers are interested to see how his candidacy will unfold, because there are just more questions surrounding Donald Trump than some of the other candidates. His policy positions, his sort of star power, his previous life is on The Apprentice. So I think a lot of people knew something about Donald Trump, but really wanted to see what he looked like as a presidential candidate. And so that certainly mattered. But on the other hand, I think it also mattered that there were a lot of candidates, a lot of governors, senators trying to introduce themselves to a more national audience than they had before. And so certainly many of those viewers were interested in figuring out who they want to support going forward in the nominating process.
Does the intense interest in the Republican race, exemplified by the large ratings for the Fox debate, bode well for the Republicans in general going into the election?
I think it's a little bit hard to say at this point. Certainly, I think Republicans can be happy that they have a crowded field, many options to choose from, but it is possible, depending on how this unfolds, that some of Donald Trump's statements and positions that actually are resonating with some voters could be damaging to the Republicans' overall brand. And I'm talking specifically, most recently, about his comments about illegal immigrants and some of his ideas about immigration policy, essentially deporting illegal immigrants, whereas the general public has been more supportive over the years of a path to citizenship for those immigrants who are here illegally. You know, Donald Trump will take us in the opposite direction, and his position is at odds, at least in part, with some of the other Republican candidates. And so the contrast between Donald Trump and some of the other candidates does have the potential to damage the Republican brand for the eventual nominee. Now, if the eventual nominee is Donald Trump, which for the record I don't think is likely, that's a different story. But I can just imagine in a general election some nominating contest debate clips being played. And I think the candidates, particularly those who really have a shot at it, are sort of cognizant of that as they're thinking about how to deal with Donald Trump.
What were some of the major issues addressed in the first Fox debate?
Well, it sort of depended on the candidate, which I thought was pretty interesting. So, as is well known by now, host Megyn Kelly asks Donald Trump about some offensive comments toward women. On the other hand, many of the candidates were asked about their policy positions, particularly those sitting elected officials. So immigration was certainly a very important issue because, again, the candidates do have contrasting backgrounds when it comes to immigration, whether it's Marco Rubio or Jeb Bush, and then in contrast to Trump. On the other hand, Governor Kasich, he was asked about his positions on accepting federal Medicaid funds, something that as governor of Ohio he has done, even though many other Republican governors haven't. And so it was a little bit of immigration policy, a little bit of domestic policy, certainly foreign policy was important, something that a lot of the candidates are talking about and is always important in a presidential election, even though these candidates are largely outside of government or, of course, governors or senators.
Among the 7 candidates in what was called the undercard debate, the kids' table debate, which aired before the main Fox debate, consensus was that Carly Fiorina won. What does this mean for her race, and did she get a bump in the polls following this particular debate?
Well, with the candidates sort of below the very top tier, the movement in the polls often really centers around name recognition. And there's no doubt that being the winner, the unofficial winner of the kids' table debate helped her. So even if it's not reflected in any strong bumps in the polls, she's now getting more media coverage, and the media are saying that she won. It's not that many viewers actually saw that debate, but the media, the people who were tuned in, have sort of given this verdict, and so that helps her. On the other hand, it's also raised scrutiny, sort of more attention to Hewlett Packard's performance when she ran it, which was, it didn't go well. And so on the one hand, I think it gave her a bump, but on the other hand, it's also increased scrutiny.
Are you aware of any political scientists who think Trump actually has a shot at becoming president?
No, I am not. Political scientists in general sort of stand by the research about the invisible primary, which suggests that party endorsements from elected officials in the party and party leaders really are key to winning the nominating contest, along with the money that they raise, not money that they have themselves, but the money that they raise, because those things are a sign of grassroots support on the one hand, if it comes from a lot of donors, and then elite support from party elected officials who presumably are paying closer attention, know something about the candidates to a greater extent than voters, and then in turn can influence voters' opinions. That's been the model ever since the McGovern-Fraser reforms in the early 1970s, where presidential candidates are chosen by caucuses and primaries instead of at conventions by elites. That said, Norm Ornstein, a respected political scientist at the American Enterprise Institute, recently wrote an article that suggested that maybe we're not taking Trump seriously enough, that he might not, in fact, flame out in the ways that we've seen so many candidates like him or in past nominating contests at this early stage. I think it's obviously, I don't have a crystal ball, I don't know, but my guess would be that the political science research that really focuses on the endorsements and the money, and thrown in with some polls and in early states, will once again prove to be the most important thing, and that at this point would mean that it's most likely that Jeb Bush would be the nominee. That said, political science is certainly not a perfect science and doesn't have perfect predictive power, so we'll have to keep watching.
Other than Jeb Bush, do you think there are any other Republican candidates whose fortunes will rise in the polls as the election day approaches?
I think it is certainly worth keeping an eye on Marco Rubio. It's certainly worth keeping an eye on Scott Walker. Rand Paul is actually doing fairly well when it comes to endorsements, although I don't know, he might have sort of gotten all that he can get from the Tea Party wing at some level. I'm not sure. So certainly Bush is in the lead when it comes to endorsements, but it's also worth watching Paul, Rubio, Walker, and then Kasich. Kasich is down, but he sort of emerges as a potentially more electable alternative, particularly if Jeb Bush falters.
Opposition to Obamacare has played a huge role in defining Republican candidates. Are we going to see a lot more talk about Obamacare, repealing Obamacare as the 2016 elections approach?
We will continue to hear about repealing Obamacare, but then I think the onus is really on candidates to be clear about what they would replace it with. Because it's one thing to say you want to repeal it, but on the other hand, as more and more people are insured, it'll be important for a successful candidate to actually indicate what would replace it.
The state of the economy always plays a significant role in elections. We obviously can't predict what the economy will look like come November of 2016, but historically, do good economies favor one party over the other?
Good economies favor the party of the incumbent president. Now, obviously in 2016, there's no incumbent on the ballot. So in this case, it would be favoring the incumbent party. So if the economy is growing, if the economy is doing well, that would certainly favor the Democratic nominee. Just as we saw in 2008, there was no incumbent on the ballot, but the sagging economy really hurt John McCain, even though it was, of course, under President Bush's watch that the economy went south. So a good economy would help Democrats, a bad economy would help Republicans.
While still the Democratic front runner, Hillary Clinton has seen her poll numbers dip due mainly to Bernie Sanders. When Access Minnesota returns, we look at the Democratic presidential candidates.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Here's more of our conversation on the 2016 presidential election with University of Minnesota Associate Professor of Political Science, Catherine Pearson. Just a few months ago, it appeared that Hillary Clinton had no serious challengers, but along came Bernie Sanders. His numbers are up in the polls. He's attracting huge crowds to his rallies. How big of a threat is Sanders to Hillary Clinton?
Sanders certainly speaks to some of Clinton's vulnerabilities. The support for Sanders, it speaks to the fact that liberals are not enthusiastic about Clinton. It speaks to the sort of the email issues that continue to flag her and fit into a framework of questions about her trustworthiness. We've seen that in polls. But he himself as a candidate does not pose a serious challenge to Clinton. He just won't get the endorsements, the money, or the support in enough states to really be a serious threat.
So you don't see a lot of similarities then between the rise of Sanders and the rise of Obama back in 2008 against Clinton?
I don't. Certainly, I think Obama took Clinton by surprise at some level, but he out-organized the Clinton campaign, or his campaign out-organized her campaign. He had a strategy to the end that focused not only on primary states, but also on caucus states. And he really pretty quickly got a lot of endorsements that I think Clinton had been expecting. And so the similarities are really very, very few.
Do you think the email issue will continue to dog Hillary Clinton throughout the campaign until there's some resolution one way or the other?
I think it really depends. I think that among her detractors, it will certainly continue to be mentioned. I think as a campaign issue that actually really hurts her going forward, it really depends how it unfolds, and it's a little bit too early to tell at this point.
Vice President Joe Biden is considering entering the race. Has this at all affected Clinton's polling numbers?
Well, his polling numbers in terms of as a potential candidate are not great. However, his likability numbers are actually quite good. And so it's unclear what would happen if he actually gets into the race. But what he doesn't have is a campaign organization that's ready to go. He doesn't have party endorsements, although he'd certainly get some. And he just hasn't been doing the fundraising, the organizing, the things that one really needs to do by this point, even as an incumbent vice president, to do well at this point. I don't know whether or not he will enter the race, but he's run twice before, didn't do particularly well. He's been a popular vice president, but not necessarily a vice president that people have been seeing as the successor to Obama. The person that I think a lot of Democrats have been seeing as the successor has been Clinton, and she's certainly acted in that way.
As we approach the 2016 elections, what do you think will be the big issues that the Democratic candidates will push?
Certainly the conversation will revolve around the economy, as it always does. But we're also hearing, actually from candidates in both parties, about income inequality and college affordability and some of these issues that really plague the middle class. Now, Democrats and Republicans have different solutions to these issues, but I think the fact that income inequality is increasing, college is becoming more expensive, and sort of the polarization between the have and the have-nots has increased, is becoming an issue that both parties' candidates are concerned about. We've also seen, obviously, a lot of attention to race with the Black Lives Matter movement, and then other issues as well. We see Democrats being more attentive to those issues than Republicans, so I certainly expect to see more conversation among Democrats about the issue of race. African Americans vote for Democrats at rates of 90% or above, but that doesn't mean that they want their votes to be taken for granted. And so I expect to see more attention, in part inspired by the Black Lives Movement going forward. Immigration will continue to be an issue, but again, for a general election voter, the majority of Americans at this point express support for a path to citizenship for those who are already here illegally, and that majority has actually increased. It's not necessarily a majority among Republican voters, Republican nominating contest voters, but as a general election issue, I think that's an issue that could really hurt the Republican brand.
As the 2016 elections approach, do you foresee that Democratic candidates will embrace President Obama and his policies, or do you see them distancing themselves from him and his policies?
I think it largely depends. I think if Clinton is the nominee, which I would guess will be the case, she was a member of his administration, so I think she would largely embrace his policies. probably not every single one, but largely embrace them. And I think really any Democratic candidate would be wise to. Unless the economy is in real trouble or the president's polling numbers drop precipitously. Otherwise, I would expect that any Democratic candidate would sort of embrace certainly the things about the president and the economy that are popular is a good campaign strategy. We can look back to 2000, and it's a lot of Monday morning analysis, but that said, I think a lot of people with good reason say, if only Al Gore had campaigned more strongly on the legacy of the Clinton administration, he might have actually won in the Electoral College, not just the popular vote. A lot of Democrats say that, and I think sort of research backs that up.
If we go out on a limb and predict that the nominees for the two major parties will be Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton, do you foresee this fueling more voter cynicism? After all, they both come from what have been called political legacies, what have been called almost imperial families, because of Bill Clinton being in the White House, two previous President Bushes being in the White House. Is this going to fuel voter sentiments against the system if these are the only two candidates we have to deal with, the only two electable candidates?
To some extent, yes. I think that voters in the U.S., they like new blood. They don't like this notion that politics can be passed down. But by the same token, I think it's likely that voters will choose Bush and Clinton as their respective parties' nominees. And so it's sort of tough, because on the one hand, voters are thinking about electability, voters are thinking about experience, voters are thinking about a lot of important judgments when it comes to who they want in the White House. On the other hand, I think that the notion that it's certainly possible that both candidates could come from political families who've been in the White House, there is something distasteful and almost un-American about that to voters, but it's not a strong enough sentiment that it will necessarily prevent it from happening.
Catherine Pearson is an associate professor of political science at the University of Minnesota. Professor Pearson, thanks so much for joining us again on Access Minnesota.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That's all for this month's edition of Access Minnesota. We'll see you again next month. Thanks for watching.
Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Join us again next week as we bring you the newsmakers and stories that shape our everyday lives. Access Minnesota is produced by the Minnesota Broadcasters Association in cooperation with the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts.